Chapter 31 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. There was peace and quiet for some time after this storm. Jennie went the next day and brought Vesta away with her. The joy of the reunion between mother and child made up for many other worries. Now I can do by her as I ought, she thought, and 3 or 4 times during the day she found herself humming a little song. Lester came only occasionally at first. He was trying to make himself believe that he ought to do something toward reforming his life, toward bringing about that eventual separation which he had suggested. He did not like the idea of a child being in this apartment, particularly that particular child. He fought his way through a period of calculated neglect and then began to return to the apartment more regularly. In spite of all its drawbacks, it was a place of quiet, peace, and very notable personal comfort. During the first days of Lester's return, it was difficult for Jennie to adjust matters so as to keep the playful, nervous, almost uncontrollable child from annoying the staid, emphatic, commercial-minded man. Jennie gave Vesta a severe talking to the first night Lester telephoned that he was coming, telling her that he was a very bad-tempered man who didn't like children and that she mustn't go near him. "You mustn't talk," she said. "You mustn't ask questions. Let Mama ask you what you want, and don't reach ever." Vesta agreed solemnly, but her childish mind hardly grasped the full significance of the warning. Lester came at 7. Jennie, who had taken pains to array Vesta as attractively as possible, had gone into her bedroom to give her own toilet a last touch. Vesta was supposedly in the kitchen. As a matter of fact, she had followed her mother to the door of the sitting room, where now she could be plainly seen. Lester hung up his hat and coat, then turning, he caught his first glimpse. The child looked very sweet. He admitted that at a glance. She was arrayed in a blue dotted white flannel dress with a soft roll collar and cuffs, and the costume was completed by white stockings and shoes. Her corn-colored ringlets hung gaily about her face. Blue eyes, rosy lips, rosy cheeks completed the picture. Lester stared, almost inclined to say something, but he restrained himself. Vesta shyly retreated. When Jennie came out, he commented on the fact that Vesta had arrived. "Rather sweet-looking child," he said. "Do you have much trouble in making her mind?" "Not much," she returned. Jennie went on to the dining room, and Lester overheard a scrap of their conversation. "Who are he?" asked Vesta. "Shh! That's your Uncle Lester. Didn't I tell you you mustn't talk?" "Are he your uncle?" "No, dear. Don't talk now. Run into the kitchen." "Are he only my uncle?" "Yes. Now run along." "All right." In spite of himself, Lester had to smile. What might have followed if the child had been homely, misshapen, peevish, or all three, can scarcely be conjectured. Had Jennie been less tactful even in the beginning, he might have obtained a disagreeable impression. As it was, the natural beauty of the child, combined with the mother's gentle diplomacy in keeping her in the background, served to give him that fleeting glimpse of innocence and youth which is always pleasant. The thought struck him that Jennie had been the mother of a child all these years. She had been separated from it for months at a time. She had never even hinted at its existence, and yet her affection for Vesta was obviously great. "It's queer," he said. "She's a peculiar woman." One morning Lester was sitting in the parlor reading his paper when he thought he heard something stir. He turned and was surprised to see a large blue eye fixed upon him through the crack of a neighboring door. The effect was most disconcerting. It was not like the ordinary eye, which under such embarrassing circumstances would have been immediately withdrawn. It kept its position with deliberate boldness. He turned his paper solemnly and looked again. There was the eye. He turned it again. Still the eye was present. He crossed his legs and looked again. Now the eye was gone. This little episode, unimportant in itself, was yet informed with the saving grace of comedy, a thing to which Lester was especially responsive. Although not in the least inclined to relax his attitude of aloofness, he found his mind, in the minutest degree, tickled by the mysterious appearance. The corners of his mouth were animated by a desire to turn up. He did not give way to the feeling, and stuck by his paper, but the incident remained very clearly in his mind. The young wayfarer had made her first really important impression upon him. Not long after this, Lester was sitting one morning at breakfast, calmly eating his chop and conning his newspaper, when he was aroused by another visitation, this time not quite so simple. Jennie had given Vesta her breakfast and set her to amuse herself alone until Lester should leave the house. Jennie was seated at the table pouring out the coffee when Vesta suddenly appeared, very businesslike in manner, and marched through the room. Lester looked up, and Jennie colored and arose. "What is it, Vesta?" she inquired, following her. By this time, however, Vesta had reached the kitchen, secured a little broom, and returned, a droll determination lighting her face. "I want my little broom," she exclaimed, and marched sedately past, at which manifestation of spirit Lester again twitched internally, this time allowing the slightest suggestion of a smile to play across his mouth. The final effect of this intercourse was gradually to break down the feeling of distaste Lester had for the child, and to establish in its place a sort of tolerant recognition of her possibilities as a human being. The developments of the next 6 months were of a kind to further relax the strain of opposition which still existed in Lester's mind. Although not at all resigned to the somewhat tainted atmosphere in which he was living, he yet found himself so comfortable that he could not persuade himself to give it up. It was too much like a bed of down. Jennie was too worshipful. The condition of unquestioned liberty, so far as all his old social relationships were concerned, coupled with the privilege of quiet simplicity and affection in the home, was too inviting. He lingered on, and began to feel that perhaps it would be just as well to let matters rest as they were. During this period his friendly relations with the little Vesta insensibly strengthened. He discovered that there was a real flavor of humor about Vesta's doings, and so came to watch for its development. She was forever doing something interesting, and although Jennie watched over her with a care that was in itself a revelation to him, nevertheless Vesta managed to elude every effort to suppress her and came straight home with her remarks. Once, for example, she was sawing away at a small piece of meat upon her large plate with her big knife, when Lester remarked to Jennie that it might be advisable to get her a little breakfast set. "She can hardly handle these knives." "Yes," said Vesta instantly. "I need a little knife. My hand is just so very little." She held it up. Jennie, who could never tell what was to follow, reached over and put it down, while Lester, with difficulty, restrained a desire to laugh. Another morning, not long after, she was watching Jennie put lumps of sugar in Lester's cup when she broke in with, "I want 2 lumps in mine, Mama." "No, dearest," replied Jennie. "You don't need any in yours. You have milk to drink." "Uncle Lester has 2," she protested. "Yes," returned Jennie, "but you're only a little girl. Besides, you mustn't say anything like that at the table. It isn't nice." "Uncle Lester eats too much sugar," was her immediate rejoinder, at which that fine gourmet smiled broadly. "I don't know about that," he put in, for the first time deigning to answer her directly. "That sounds like the fox and grapes to me." Vesta smiled back at him, and now that the ice was broken, she chattered on unrestrainedly. One thing led to another, and at last Lester felt as though, in a way, the little girl belonged to him. He was willing even that she should share in such opportunities as his position and wealth might make possible, provided, of course, that he stayed with Jennie and that they worked out some arrangement which would not put him hopelessly out of touch with the world which was back of him, and which he had to keep constantly in mind. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The following spring the showrooms and warehouses were completed, and Lester removed his office to the new building. Heretofore he had been transacting all his business affairs at the Grand Pacific and the club. From now on he felt himself to be firmly established in Chicago, as if that was to be his future home. A large number of details were thrown upon him: the control of a considerable office force and the handling of various important transactions. It took away from him the need of traveling, that duty going to Amy's husband, under the direction of Robert. The latter was doing his best to push his personal interests, not only through the influence he was bringing to bear upon his sisters, but through his reorganization of the factory. Several men whom Lester was personally fond of were in danger of elimination. But Lester did not hear of this, and Kane Sr. was inclined to give Robert a free hand. Age was telling on him. He was glad to see someone with a strong policy come up and take charge. Lester did not seem to mind. Apparently he and Robert were on better terms than ever before. Matters might have gone on smoothly enough were it not for the fact that Lester's private life with Jennie was not a matter which could be permanently kept under cover. At times he was seen driving with her by people who knew him in a social and commercial way. He was for brazing it out on the ground that he was a single man and at liberty to associate with anybody he pleased. Jennie might be any young woman of good family in whom he was interested. He did not propose to introduce her to anybody if he could help it, and he always made it a point to be a fast traveler in driving, in order that others might not attempt to detain and talk to him. At the theater, as had been said, she was simply Miss Gerhardt. The trouble was that many of his friends were also keen observers of life. They had no quarrel to pick with Lester's conduct, only he had been seen in other cities in times past with this same woman. She must be someone whom he was maintaining irregularly. Well, what of it? Wealth and youthful spirits must have their fling. Rumors came to Robert, who, however, kept his own counsel. If Lester wanted to do this sort of thing, well and good, but there must come a time when there would be a showdown. This came about in one form about a year and a half after Lester and Jennie had been living in that North Side apartment. It so happened that, during a stretch of inclement weather in the fall, Lester was seized with a mild form of grippe. When he felt the first symptoms, he thought that his indisposition would be a matter of short duration, and tried to overcome it by taking a hot bath and a liberal dose of quinine. But the infection was stronger than he counted on. By morning he was flat on his back, with a severe fever and a splitting headache. His long period of association with Jennie had made him incautious. Policy would have dictated that he should betake himself to his hotel and endure his sickness alone. As a matter of fact, he was very glad to be in the house with her. He had to call up the office to say that he was indisposed and would not be down for a day or so. Then he yielded himself comfortably to her patient ministrations. Jennie, of course, was delighted to have Lester with her, sick or well. She persuaded him to see a doctor and have him prescribe. She brought him potions of hot lemonade and bathed his face and hands in cold water over and over. Later, when he was recovering, she made him appetizing cups of beef tea or gruel. It was during this illness that the first real contretemps occurred. Lester's sister Louise, who had been visiting friends in St. Paul, and who had written him that she might stop off to see him on her way, decided upon an earlier return than she had originally planned. While Lester was sick at his apartment, she arrived in Chicago. Calling up the office and finding that he was not there and would not be down for several days, she asked where he could be reached. "I think he is at his rooms in the Grand Pacific," said an incautious secretary. "He's not feeling well." Louise, a little disturbed, telephoned to the Grand Pacific and was told that Mr. Kane had not been there for several days, did not, as a matter of fact, occupy his rooms more than 1 or 2 days a week. Piqued by this, she telephoned his club. It so happened that at the club there was a telephone boy who had called up the apartment a number of times for Lester himself. He had not been cautioned not to give its number. As a matter of fact, it had never been asked for by anyone else. When Louise stated that she was Lester's sister and was anxious to find him, the boy replied, "I think he lives at 19 Schiller Place." "Whose address is that you're giving?" inquired a passing clerk. "Mr. Kane's." "Well, don't be giving out addresses. Don't you know that yet?" The boy apologized, but Louise had hung up the receiver and was gone. About an hour later, curious as to this third residence of her brother, Louise arrived at Schiller Place. Ascending the steps, it was a 2-apartment house, she saw the name of Kane on the door leading to the second floor. Ringing the bell, she was opened to by Jennie, who was surprised to see so fashionably attired a young woman. "This is Mr. Kane's apartment, I believe," began Louise condescendingly, as she looked in at the open door behind Jennie. She was a little surprised to meet a young woman, but her suspicions were as yet only vaguely aroused. "Yes," replied Jennie. "He's sick, I believe. I'm his sister. May I come in?" Jennie, had she had time to collect her thoughts, would have tried to make some excuse, but Louise, with the audacity of her birth and station, swept past before Jennie could say a word. Once inside, Louise looked about inquiringly. She found herself in the sitting room, which gave into the bedroom where Lester was lying. Vesta happened to be playing in one corner of the room, and stood up to eye the newcomer. The open bedroom showed Lester quite plainly lying in a bed, a window to the left of him, his eyes closed. "Oh, there you are, old fellow!" exclaimed Louise. "What's ailing you?" she hurried on. Lester, who at the sound of her voice had opened his eyes, realized in an instant how things were. He pulled himself up on one elbow, but words failed him. "Why, hello, Louise," he finally forced himself to say. "Where did you come from?" "St. Paul. I came back sooner than I thought," she answered lamely, a sense of something wrong irritating her. "I had a hard time finding you, too. Who's your—" She was about to say pretty housekeeper, but turned to find Jennie dazedly gathering up certain articles in the adjoining room and looking dreadfully distraught. Lester cleared his throat hopelessly. His sister swept the place with an observing eye. It took in the home atmosphere, which was both pleasing and suggestive. There was a dress of Jennie's lying across the chair in a familiar way, which caused Miss Kane to draw herself up warily. She looked at her brother, who had a rather curious expression in his eyes. He seemed slightly nonplussed, but cool and defiant. "You shouldn't have come out here," said Lester finally, before Louise could give vent to the rising question in her mind. "Why shouldn't I?" she exclaimed, angered at the brazen confession. "You're my brother, aren't you? Why should you have any place that I couldn't come? Well, I like that. And from you to me." "Listen, Louise," went on Lester, drawing himself up further on one elbow. "You know as much about life as I do. There is no need of our getting into an argument. I didn't know you were coming, or I would have made some other arrangements." "Other arrangements, indeed," she sneered. "I should think as much. The idea!" She was greatly irritated to think that she had fallen into this trap. It was really disgraceful of Lester. "I wouldn't be so haughty about it," he declared, his color rising. "I'm not apologizing to you for my conduct. I'm saying I would have made other arrangements, which is a very different thing from begging your pardon. If you don't want to be civil, you needn't." "Why, Lester Kane," she exclaimed, her cheeks flaming, "I thought better of you. Honestly, I did. I should think you would be ashamed of yourself, living here in open—" She paused without using the word. "And our friends scattered all over the city. It's terrible. I thought you had more sense of decency and consideration." "Decency nothing," he flared. "I tell you I'm not apologizing to you. If you don't like this, you know what you can do." "Oh!" she exclaimed. "This from my own brother! And for the sake of that creature! Whose child is that?" she demanded savagely and yet curiously. "Never mind, it's not mine. If it were, it wouldn't make any difference. I wish you wouldn't busy yourself about my affairs." Jennie, who had been moving about the dining room beyond the sitting room, heard the cutting references to herself. She winced with pain. "Don't flatter yourself. I won't any more," retorted Louise. "I should think, though, that you, of all men, would be above anything like this. And that with a woman so obviously beneath you. Why, I thought she was—" She was again going to add "your housekeeper," but she was interrupted by Lester, who was angry to the point of brutality. "Never mind what you thought she was," he growled. "She's better than some who do the so-called superior thinking. I know what you think. It's neither here nor there, I tell you. I'm doing this, and I don't care what you think. I have to take the blame. Don't bother about me." "Well, I won't, I assure you," she flung back. "It's quite plain that your family means nothing to you. But if you had any sense of decency, Lester Kane, you would never let your sister be trapped into coming into a place like this. I'm disgusted, that's all, and so will the others when they hear of it." She turned on her heel and walked scornfully out, a withering look being reserved for Jennie, who had unfortunately stepped near the door of the dining room. Vesta had disappeared. Jennie came in a little while later and closed the door. She knew of nothing to say. Lester, his thick hair pushed back from his vigorous face, leaned back moodily on his pillow. What a devilish trick of fortune, he thought. Now she would go home and tell it to the family. His father would know, and his mother, Robert, Imogene, Amy, all would hear. He would have no explanation to make. She had seen. He stared at the wall meditatively. Meanwhile, Jennie, moving about her duties, also found food for reflection. So this was her real position in another woman's eyes. Now she could see what the world thought. This family was as aloof from her as if it lived on another planet. To his sisters and brothers, his father and mother, she was a bad woman, a creature far beneath him socially, far beneath him mentally and morally, a creature of the streets. And she had hoped somehow to rehabilitate herself in the eyes of the world. It cut her as nothing before had ever done. The thought tore a great gaping wound in her sensibilities. She was really low and vile in her, Louise's eyes, in the world's eyes, basically so in Lester's eyes. How could it be otherwise? She went about numb and still, but the ache of defeat and disgrace was under it all. Oh, If she could only see some way to make herself right with the world, to live honorably, to be decent. How could that possibly be brought about? It ought to be. She knew that. But how? End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Outraged in her family pride, Louise lost no time in returning to Cincinnati, where she told the story of her discovery, embellished with many details. According to her, she was met at the door by a silly-looking, white-faced woman, who did not even offer to invite her in when she announced her name, but stood there looking just as guilty as a person possibly could. Lester had also acted shamefully, having outbrazened the matter to her face. When she had demanded to know whose the child was, he had refused to tell her. "It isn't mine," was all he would say. "Oh dear," exclaimed Mrs. Kane, who was the first to hear the story. "My son, my Lester, how could he have done it?" "And such a creature!" exclaimed Louise emphatically, as though the words needed to be reiterated to give them any shadow of reality. "I went there solely because I thought I could help him," continued Louise. "I thought when they said he was indisposed that he might be seriously ill. How should I have known?" "Poor Lester!" exclaimed her mother. "To think he would come to anything like that!" Mrs. Kane turned the difficult problem over in her mind, and having no previous experiences whereby to measure it, telephoned for old Archibald, who came out from the factory and sat through the discussion with a solemn countenance. So Lester was living openly with a woman of whom they had never heard. He would probably be as defiant and indifferent as his nature was strong. The standpoint of parental authority was impossible. Lester was a centralized authority in himself, and if any overtures for a change of conduct were to be made, they would have to be very diplomatically executed. Archibald Kane returned to the manufactory, sore and disgusted, but determined that something ought to be done. He held a consultation with Robert, who confessed that he had heard disturbing rumors from time to time, but had not wanted to say anything. Mrs. Kane suggested that Robert might go to Chicago and have a talk with Lester. "He ought to see that this thing, if continued, is going to do him irreparable damage," said Mr. Kane. "He cannot hope to carry it off successfully. Nobody can. He ought to marry her, or he ought to quit. I want you to tell him that for me." "All well and good," said Robert, "but who's going to convince him? I'm sure I don't want the job." "I hope to," said old Archibald, "eventually. But you'd better go up and try, anyhow. It can't do any harm. He might come to his senses." "I don't believe it," replied Robert. "He's a strong man. You see how much good talk does down here. Still, I'll go if it will relieve your feelings any. Mother wants it." "Yes, yes," said his father distractedly. "Better go." Accordingly, Robert went. Without allowing himself to anticipate any particular measure of success in this adventure, he rode pleasantly into Chicago, confident in the reflection that he had all the powers of morality and justice on his side. Upon Robert's arrival, the third morning after Louise's interview, he called up the warerooms, but Lester was not there. He then telephoned to the house and tactfully made an appointment. Lester was still indisposed, but he preferred to come down to the office, and he did. He met Robert in his cheerful, nonchalant way, and together they talked business for a time. Then followed a pregnant silence. "Well, I suppose you know what brought me up here," began Robert tentatively. "I think I could make a guess at it," Lester replied. "They were all very much worried over the fact that you were sick, Mother particularly. You're not in any danger of having a relapse, are you?" "I think not." "Louise said there was some sort of peculiar menage she ran into up here. You're not married, are you?" "No." "The young woman Louise saw is just—" Robert waved his hand expressively. Lester nodded. "I don't want to be inquisitive, Lester. I didn't come up for that. I'm simply here because the family felt that I ought to come. Mother was so very much distressed that I couldn't do less than see you for her sake." He paused, and Lester, touched by the fairness and respect of his attitude, felt that mere courtesy at least made some explanation due. "I don't know that anything I can say will help matters much," he replied thoughtfully. "There's really nothing to be said. I have the woman, and the family has its objections. The chief difficulty about things seems to be the bad luck in being found out." He stopped, and Robert turned over the substance of this worldly reasoning in his mind. Lester was very calm about it. He seemed, as usual, to be most convincingly sane. "You're not contemplating marrying her, are you?" queried Robert hesitantly. "I hadn't come to that," answered Lester coolly. They looked at each other quietly for a moment, and then Robert turned his glance to the distant scene of the city. "It is useless to ask whether you are seriously in love with her, I suppose," ventured Robert. "I don't know whether I'd be able to discuss that divine Nephlitis with you or not," returned Lester with a touch of grim humor. "I have never experienced the sensation myself. All I know is that the lady is very pleasing to me." "Well, it's all a question of your well-being and the family's, Lester," went on Robert after another pause. "Morality doesn't seem to figure in it anyway. At least you and I can't discuss that together. Your feelings on that score naturally relate to you alone, but the matter of your own personal welfare seems to me to be substantial enough grounds to base a plea on. The family's feelings and pride are also fairly important. Father's the kind of man who sets more store by the honor of his family than most men. You know that as well as I do, of course." "I know how Father feels about it," returned Lester. "The whole business is as clear to me as it is to any of you, though offhand I don't see just what's to be done about it. These matters aren't always of a day's growth, and they can't be settled in a day. The girl's here. To a certain extent I'm responsible that she is here. While I'm not willing to go into details, there's always more in these affairs than appears on the court calendar." "Of course I don't know what your relations with her have been," returned Robert, "and I'm not curious to know, but it does look like a bit of injustice all around, don't you think, unless you intend to marry her?" This last was put forth as a feeler. "I might be willing to agree to that, too," was Lester's baffling reply, "if anything were to be gained by it. The point is the woman is here, and the family is in possession of the fact. Now, if there is anything to be done, I have to do it. There isn't anybody else who can act for me in this matter." Lester lapsed into a silence, and Robert rose and paced the floor, coming back after a time to say, "You say you haven't any idea of marrying her, or rather, you haven't come to it. I wouldn't, Lester. It seems to me you would be making the mistake of your life from every point of view. I don't want to orate, but a man of your position has so much to lose. You can't afford to do it. Aside from family considerations, you have too much at stake. You'd be simply throwing your life away." He paused, with his right hand held out before him, as was customary when he was deeply in earnest, and Lester felt the candor and simplicity of his appeal. Robert was not criticizing him now. He was making an appeal to him, and this was somewhat different. The appeal passed without comment, however, and then Robert began on a new tack, this time picturing old Archibald's fondness for Lester and the hope he had always entertained that he would marry some well-to-do Cincinnati girl, Catholic if agreeable to him, but at least worthy of his station, And Mrs. Kane felt the same way. Surely Lester must realize that. "I know just how all of them feel about it," Lester interrupted at last, "but I don't see that anything's to be done right now." "You mean that you don't think it would be policy for you to give her up just at present?" "I mean that she's been exceptionally good to me, and that I am morally under obligation to do the best I can by her. What that may be, I can't tell." "To live with her?" inquired Robert coolly. "Certainly not to turn her out bag and baggage if she has been accustomed to live with me," replied Lester. Robert sat down again, as if he considered his recent appeal futile. "Can't family reason persuade you to make some amicable arrangement with her and let her go?" "Not without due consideration of the matter, no." "You don't think you could hold out some hope that things will end quickly, something that would give me a reasonable excuse for softening down the pain of it to the family?" "I would be perfectly willing to do anything which would take away the edge of this thing for the family. But the truth's the truth. I can't see any room for equivocation between you and me. As I've said before, these relationships are involved with things which make it impossible to discuss them. Unfair to me, unfair to the woman. No one can see how they are to be handled, except the people that are in them, and even they can't always see. I'll be a damned dog to stand up here and give you my word to do anything except the best I can." Lester stopped, and now Robert rose and paced the floor again, only to come back after a time and say, "You don't think there's anything to be done just at the present?" "Not at the present." "Very well, then. I expect I might as well be going. I don't know that there's anything else we can talk about." "Won't you stay and take lunch with me? I think I might manage to get down to the hotel if you will stay." "No, thank you," answered Robert. "I believe I can make the 1 o'clock train for Cincinnati. I'll try, anyhow." They stood before each other now, Lester pale and rather flaccid, Robert clear, wax-like, well-knit and shrewd, and one could see the difference time had already made. Robert was the clean, decisive man, Lester the man of doubts. Robert was the spirit of business energy and integrity embodied, Lester the spirit of commercial self-sufficiency, looking at life with an uncertain eye. Together they made a striking picture, which was none the less powerful for the thoughts that were now running through their minds. "Well," said the older brother after a time, "I don't suppose there is anything more I can say. I had hoped to make you feel just as we do about things, but of course you are your own best judge of this. If you don't see it now, nothing I could say would make you. It strikes me as a very bad move on your part, though." Lester listened. He said nothing, but his face expressed an unchanged purpose. Robert turned for his hat, and they walked to the office door together. "I'll put the best face I can on it," said Robert, and walked out. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. In this world of ours, the activities of animal life seem to be limited to a plane or circle, as if that were an inherent necessity to the creature of a planet which is perforce compelled to swing about the sun. A fish, for instance, may not pass out of the circle of the seas without courting annihilation. A bird may not enter the domain of the fishes without paying for it dearly. From the parasite of the flowers to the monsters of the jungle and the deep, we see clearly the circumscribed nature of their movements, the emphatic manner in which life has limited them to a sphere, and we are content to note the ludicrous and invariably fatal results which attend any effort on their part to depart from their environment. In the case of man, however, the operation of this theory of limitations has not as yet been so clearly observed. The laws governing our social life are not so clearly understood as to permit of a clear generalization. Still the opinions, pleas, and judgments of society serve as boundaries which are none the less real for being intangible. When men or women err, that is, pass out from the sphere in which they are accustomed to move in, it is not as if the bird had intruded itself into the water, or the wild animal into the haunts of man. Annihilation is not the immediate result. People may do no more than elevate their eyebrows in astonishment, laugh sarcastically, lift up their hands in protest, and yet so well defined is the sphere of social activity that he who departs from it is doomed. Born and bred in this environment, the individual is practically unfitted for any other state. He is like a bird accustomed to a certain density of atmosphere, and which cannot live comfortably at either higher or lower level. Lester sat down in his easy chair by the window after his brother had gone, and gazed ruminatively out over the flourishing city. Yonder was spread out before him life with its concomitant phases of energy, hope, prosperity, and pleasure, and here he was suddenly struck by a wind of misfortune and blown aside for the time being, his prospects and purposes dissipated. Could he continue as cheerily in the paths he had hitherto pursued? Would not his relations with Jennie be necessarily affected by this sudden tide of opposition? Was not his own home now a thing of the past so far as his old easy-going relationship was concerned? All the atmosphere of unstained affection would be gone out of it now. The hearty look of approval which used to dwell in his father's eye, would it be there any longer? Robert, his relations with the manufactory, everything that was part of his old life, had been affected by this sudden intrusion of Louise. It's unfortunate, was all that he thought to himself, and therewith turned from what he considered senseless brooding to the consideration of what, if anything, was to be done. "I'm thinking I'd take a run up to Mount Clemens tomorrow, or Thursday anyhow, if I feel strong enough," he said to Jennie after he had returned. "I'm not feeling as well as I might. A few days will do me good." He wanted to get off by himself and think. Jennie packed his bag for him at the given time, and he departed, but he was in a sullen, meditative mood. During the week that followed he had ample time to think it all over, the result of his cogitations being that there was no need of making a decisive move at present. A few weeks more, one way or the other, could not make any practical difference. Neither Robert nor any other member of the family was at all likely to seek another conference with him. His business relations would necessarily go on as usual. Since they were coupled with the welfare of the manufactory, certainly no attempt to coerce him would be attempted. But the consciousness that he was at hopeless variance with his family weighed upon him. Bad business, he meditated, bad business. But he did not change. For the period of a whole year this unsatisfactory state of affairs continued. Lester did not go home for 6 months. Then, an important business conference demanding his presence, he appeared and carried it off quite as though nothing important had happened. His mother kissed him affectionately, if a little sadly. His father gave him his customary greeting, a hearty handshake. Robert, Louise, Amy, Imogene, concertedly, though without any verbal understanding, agreed to ignore the one real issue. But the feeling of estrangement was there, and it persisted. Hereafter his visits to Cincinnati were as few and far between as he could possibly make them. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. In the meantime, Jennie had been going through a moral crisis of her own. For the first time in her life, aside from the family attitude, which had afflicted her greatly, she realized what the world thought of her. She was bad. She knew that. She had yielded on 2 occasions to the force of circumstances which might have been fought out differently. If only she had had more courage. If she did not always have this haunting sense of fear. If she could only make up her mind to do the right thing. Lester would never marry her. Why should he? She loved him, but she could leave him, and it would be better for him. Probably her father would live with her if she went back to Cleveland. He would honor her for at least taking a decent stand. Yet the thought of leaving Lester was a terrible one to her. He had been so good. As for her father, she was not sure whether he would receive her or not. After the tragic visit of Louise, she began to think of saving a little money, laying it aside as best she could from her allowance. Lester was generous, and she had been able to send home regularly $15 a week to maintain the family, as much as they had lived on before, without any help from the outside. She spent $20 to maintain the table, for Lester required the best of everything, fruits, meats, desserts, liquors, and what not. The rent was $55, with clothes and extras of varying sum. Lester gave her $50 a week, but somehow it had all gone. She thought how she might economize, but this seemed wrong. Better go without taking anything, if she were going, was the thought that came to her. It was the only decent thing to do. She thought over this week after week, after the advent of Louise, trying to nerve herself to the point where she could speak or act. Lester was consistently generous and kind, but she felt at times that he himself might wish it. He was thoughtful, abstracted. Since the scene with Louise, it seemed to her that he had been a little different. If she could only say to him that she was not satisfied with the way she was living, and then leave. But he himself had plainly indicated after his discovery of Vesta that her feelings on that score could not matter so very much to him, since he thought the presence of the child would definitely interfere with his ever marrying her. It was her presence he wanted on another basis, and he was so forceful she could not argue with him very well. She decided if she went it would be best to write a letter and tell him why. Then maybe when he knew how she felt he would forgive her and think nothing more about it. The condition of the Gerhardt family was not improving. Since Jennie had left, Martha had married. After several years of teaching in the public schools of Cleveland, she had met a young architect, and they were united after a short engagement. Martha had always been a little ashamed of her family, and now, when this new life dawned, she was anxious to keep the connection as slight as possible. She barely notified the members of the family of the approaching marriage, Jennie not at all, and to the actual ceremony she invited only Bass and George. Gerhardt, Veronica, and William resented the slight. Gerhardt ventured upon no comment. He had had too many rebuffs. But Veronica was angry. She hoped that life would give her an opportunity to pay her sister off. William, of course, did not mind particularly. He was interested in the possibilities of becoming an electrical engineer, a career which one of his school teachers had pointed out to him as being attractive and promising. Jennie heard of Martha's marriage after it was all over, a note from Veronica giving her the main details. She was glad from one point of view, but realized that her brothers and sisters were drifting away from her. A little while after Martha's marriage, Veronica and William went to reside with George, a break which was brought about by the attitude of Gerhardt himself. Ever since his wife's death and the departure of the other children, he had been subject to moods of profound gloom, from which he was not easily aroused. Life, it seemed, was drawing to a close for him, although he was only 65 years of age. The earthly ambitions he had once cherished were gone forever. He saw Sebastian, Martha, and George out in the world practically ignoring him, contributing nothing at all to a home which should never have taken a dollar from Jennie. Veronica and William were restless. They objected to leaving school and going to work, apparently preferring to live on money which Gerhardt had long since concluded was not being come by honestly. He was now pretty well satisfied as to the true relations of Jennie and Lester. At first he had believed them to be married, but the way Lester had neglected Jennie for long periods, the humbleness with which she ran at his beck and call, her fear of telling him about Vesta, somehow it all pointed to the same thing. She had not been married at home. Gerhardt had never had sight of her marriage certificate. Since she was away she might have been married, but he did not believe it. The real trouble was that Gerhardt had grown intensely morose and crotchety, and it was becoming impossible for young people to live with him. Veronica and William felt it. They resented the way in which he took charge of the expenditures after Martha left. He accused them of spending too much on clothes and amusements. He insisted that a smaller house should be taken, and he regularly sequestered a part of the money which Jennie sent, for what purpose they could hardly guess. As a matter of fact, Gerhardt was saving as much as possible in order to repay Jennie eventually. He thought it was sinful to go on in this way, and this was his one method, outside of his meager earnings, to redeem himself. If his other children had acted rightly by him, he felt that he would not now be left in his old age the recipient of charity from one who, despite her other good qualities, was certainly not leading a righteous life. So they quarreled. It ended one winter month when George agreed to receive his complaining brother and sister on condition that they should get something to do. Gerhardt was nonplussed for a moment, but invited them to take the furniture and go their way. His generosity shamed them for the moment. They even tentatively invited him to come and live with them, but this he would not do. He would ask the foreman of the mill he watched for the privilege of sleeping in some out-of-the-way garret. He was always liked and trusted, and this would save him a little money. So in a fit of pique he did this, and there was seen the spectacle of an old man watching through a dreary season of nights in a lonely, trafficless neighborhood while the city pursued its gaiety elsewhere. He had a wee small corner in the topmost loft of a warehouse away from the tear and grind of the factory proper. Here Gerhardt slept by day. In the afternoon he would take a little walk, strolling towards the business center or out along the banks of the Cuyahoga or the lake. As a rule, his hands were below his back, his brow bent in meditation. He would even talk to himself a little, an occasional "by chops" or "so it is" being indicative of his dreary mood. At dusk he would return, taking his stand at the lonely gate which was his post of duty. His meals were secured at a nearby working man's boarding house, such as he felt he must have. The nature of the old German's reflections at this time were of a peculiarly subtle and somber character. What was this thing life? What did it all come to after the struggle and the worry and the grieving? Where does it all go? People die. You hear nothing more of them. His wife now, she had gone. Where had her spirit taken its flight? Yet he continued to hold some strongly dogmatic convictions. He believed there was a hell and that people who sinned would go there. How about Mrs. Gerhardt? How about Jennie? He believed that both had sinned woefully. He believed that the just would be rewarded in heaven. But who were the just? Mrs. Gerhardt had not had a bad heart. Jennie was the soul of generosity. Take his son Sebastian. Sebastian was a good boy, but he was cold and certainly indifferent to his father. Take Martha. She was ambitious, but obviously selfish. Somehow the children, outside of Jennie, seemed self-centered. Bass walked off when he got married and did nothing more for anybody. Martha insisted that she needed all she made to live on. George had contributed for a little while, but had finally refused to help out. Veronica and William had been content to live on Jennie's money so long as he would allow it, and yet they knew it was not right. His very existence, was it not a commentary on the selfishness of his children? And he was getting so old. He shook his head. Mystery of mysteries. Life was truly strange and dark and uncertain. Still, he did not want to go and live with any of his children. Actually, they were not worthy of him, none but Jennie, and she was not good. So he grieved. This woeful condition of affairs was not made known to Jennie for some time. She had been sending her letters to Martha, but on her leaving, Jennie had been writing directly to Gerhardt. After Veronica's departure, Gerhardt wrote to Jennie saying that there was no need of sending any more money. Veronica and William were going to live with George. He himself had a good place in a factory and would live there a little while. He returned her a moderate sum that he had saved, $115, with the word that he would not need it. Jennie did not understand, but as the others did not write, she was not sure but what it might be all right. Her father was so determined. But by degrees, however, a sense of what it really must mean overtook her, a sense of something wrong, and she worried, hesitating between leaving Lester and going to see about her father, whether she left him or not. Would he come with her? Not here, certainly. If she were married, yes, possibly. If she were alone, probably. Yet, if she did not get some work which paid well, they would have a difficult time. It was the same old problem. What could she do? Nevertheless, she decided to act. If she could get $5 or $6 a week, they could live. This $115 which Gerhardt had saved would tide them over the worst difficulties, perhaps. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The trouble with Jennie's plan was that it did not definitely take into consideration Lester's attitude. He did care for her in an elemental way, but he was hedged about by the idea of the conventional world in which he had been reared. To say that he loved her well enough to take her for better or worse, to legalize her anomalous position, and to face the world bravely with the fact that he had chosen a wife who suited him, was perhaps going a little too far, but he really did care for her, and he was not in a mood, at this particular time, to contemplate parting with her for good. Lester was getting along to that time of life where his ideas of womanhood were fixed and not subject to change. Thus far, on his own plane and within the circle of his own associates, he had met no one who appealed to him as Jennie did. She was gentle, intelligent, gracious, a handmaiden to his every need, and he had taught her the little customs of polite society, until she was as agreeable a companion as he cared to have. He was comfortable, he was satisfied. Why seek further? But Jennie's restlessness increased day by day. She tried writing out her views, and started a half a dozen letters before she finally worded one which seemed, partially at least, to express her feelings. It was a long letter for her, and it ran as follows: Lester, dear, when you get this, I won't be here. I want you not to think harshly of me until you have read it all. I am taking Vesta and leaving, and I think it is really better that I should. Lester, I ought to do it. You know, when you met me, we were very poor, and my condition was such that I didn't think any good man would ever want me. When you came along and told me you loved me, I was hardly able to think just what I ought to do. You made me love you, Lester, in spite of myself. You know I told you that I oughtn't to do anything wrong any more, and that I wasn't good, but somehow when you were near me I couldn't think just right, and I didn't see how I was to get away from you. Papa was sick at home that time, and there was hardly anything in the house to eat. We were all doing so poorly. My brother George didn't have good shoes, and Mama was so worried. I have often thought, Lester, if Mama had not been compelled to worry so much, she might be alive today. I thought if you liked me, and I really liked you, I love you, Lester, maybe it wouldn't make so much difference about me. You know you told me right away you would like to help my family, and I felt that maybe that would be the right thing to do. We were so terribly poor. Lester, dear, I am ashamed to leave you this way. It seems so mean. But if you knew how I have been feeling these days, you would forgive me. Oh, I love you, Lester. I do, I do. But for months past, ever since your sister came, I have felt that I was doing wrong, and that I oughtn't to go on doing it. For I know how terribly wrong it is. It was wrong for me ever to have anything to do with Senator Brander. But I was such a girl then, I hardly knew what I was doing. It was wrong of me not to tell you about Vesta when I first met you, though I thought I was doing right when I did it. It was terribly wrong of me to keep her here all that time concealed, Lester. But I was afraid of you then, afraid of what you would say and do. When your sister Louise came, it all came over me somehow, clearly, and I have never been able to think right about it since. It can't be right, Lester, but I don't blame you. I blame myself. I don't ask you to marry me, Lester. I know how you feel about me and how you feel about your family, and I don't think it would be right. They would never want you to do it, and it isn't right that I should ask you. At the same time, I know I oughtn't to go on living this way. Vesta is getting along where she understands everything. She thinks you are her really, truly uncle. I have thought about it all so much. I have thought a number of times that I would try to talk to you about it, but you frighten me when you get serious, and I don't seem to be able to say what I want to. So I thought if I could just write you this and then go, you would understand. You do, Lester, don't you? You won't be angry with me? I know it's for the best for you and for me. I ought to do it. Please forgive me, Lester, please, and don't think of me any more. I will get along. But I love you. Oh, yes, I do. And I will never be grateful enough for all you have done for me. I wish you all the luck that can come to you. Please forgive me, Lester. I love you. Yes, I do. I love you. Jennie. P.S. I expect to go to Cleveland with Papa. He needs me. He is all alone. But don't come for me, Lester. It's best that you shouldn't. She put this in an envelope, sealed it, and having hidden it in her bosom for the time being, awaited for the hour when she could conveniently take her departure. It was several days before she could bring herself to the actual execution of the plan. But one afternoon, Lester having telephoned that he would not be home for a day or two, she packed some necessary garments for herself and Vesta in several trunks and sent for an expressman. She thought of telegraphing her father that she was coming, but, seeing he had no home, she thought it would be just as well to go and find him. George and Veronica had not taken all the furniture. The major portion of it was in storage, so Gerhardt had written. She might take that and furnish a little home or flat. She was ready for the end, waiting for the expressman, when the door opened and in walked Lester. For some unforeseen reason he had changed his mind. He was not in the least psychic or intuitional, but on this occasion his feelings had served him a peculiar turn. He had thought of going for a day's duck shooting with some friends in the Kankakee marshes south of Chicago, but had finally changed his mind. He even decided to go out to the house early. What prompted this he could not have said. As he neared the house he felt a little peculiar about coming home so early. Then at the sight of the two trunks standing in the middle of the room he stood dumbfounded. What did it mean? Jennie dressed and ready to depart, and Vesta in a similar condition. He stared in amazement, his brown eyes keen in inquiry. "Where are you going?" he asked. Why," she began, falling back. "I was going away." "Where to?" "I thought I would go to Cleveland," she replied. "What for?" "Why, I meant to tell you, Lester, that I didn't think I ought to stay here any longer this way. I didn't think it was right. I thought I'd tell you, but I couldn't. I wrote you a letter." "A letter!" he exclaimed. "What the deuce are you talking about? Where is the letter?" "There," she said mechanically, pointing to a small center table where the letter lay conspicuous on a large book. "And you were really going to leave me, Jennie, with just a letter?" said Lester, his voice hardening a little as he spoke. "I swear to heaven you are beyond me. What's the point?" He tore open the envelope and looked at the beginning. "Better send Vesta from the room," he suggested. She obeyed. Then she came back and stood there pale and wide-eyed, looking at the wall, at the trunks, and at him. Lester read the letter thoughtfully. He shifted his position once or twice, then dropped the paper on the floor. "Well, I'll tell you, Jennie," he said finally, looking at her curiously and wondering just what he was going to say. Here again was his chance to end this relationship if he wished. He couldn't feel that he wished it, seeing how peacefully things were running. They had gone so far together it seemed ridiculous to quit now. He truly loved her, there was no doubt about that. Still, he did not want to marry her, could not very well. She knew that. Her letter said as much. "You have this thing wrong," he went on slowly. "I don't know what comes over you at times, but you don't view the situation right. I've told you before that I can't marry you. Not now, anyhow. There are too many big things involved in this, which you don't know anything about. I love you, you know that, but my family has to be taken into consideration, and the business. You can't see the difficulties raised on these scores, but I can. Now, I don't want you to leave me. I care too much about you. I can't prevent you, of course. You can go if you want to, but I don't think you ought to want to. You don't really, do you? Sit down a minute." Jennie, who had been counting on getting away without being seen, was now thoroughly nonplussed. To have him begin a quiet argument, a plea as it were, it hurt her. He, Lester, pleading with her, and she loved him so. She went over to him, and he took her hand. "Now listen," he said. "There's really nothing to be gained by you leaving me at present. Where did you say you were going?" "To Cleveland," she replied. "Well, how did you expect to get along?" "I thought I'd take Papa if he'd come with me. He's alone now, and get something to do, maybe." "Well, what can you do, Jennie, different from what you have ever done? You wouldn't expect to be a lady's maid again, would you? Or a clerk in a store?" "I thought I might get some place as a housekeeper," she suggested. She had been counting up her possibilities, and this was the most promising idea that had occurred to her. "No, no," he grumbled, shaking his head. "There's nothing to that. There's nothing in this whole move of yours except a notion. Why, you won't be any better off morally than you are right now. You can't undo the past. It doesn't make any difference anyhow. I can't marry you now. I might in the future, but I can't tell anything about that, and I don't want to promise anything. You're not going to leave me, though, without my consent, and if you were going, I wouldn't have you dropping back into any such thing as you're contemplating. I'd make some provision for you. You don't really want to leave me, do you, Jennie?" Against Lester's strong personality and vigorous protest, Jennie's own conclusions and decisions went to pieces. Just the pressure of his hand was enough to upset her. Now she began to cry. "Don't cry, Jennie," he said. "This thing may work out better than you think. Let it rest for a while. Take off your things. You're not going to leave me any more, are you?" "No," she sobbed. He took her in his lap. "Let things rest as they are," he went on. "It's a curious world. Things can't be adjusted in a minute. They may work out. I'm putting up with some things myself that I ordinarily wouldn't stand for." He finally saw her restored to comparative calmness, smiling sadly through her tears. "Now you put those things away," he said genially, pointing to the trunks. "Besides, I want you to promise me one thing." "What's that?" asked Jennie. "No more concealment of anything, do you hear? No more thinking things out for yourself and acting without my knowing anything about it. If you have anything on your mind, I want you to come out with it. I'm not going to eat you. Talk to me about whatever is troubling you. I'll help you solve it, or if I can't, at least there won't be any concealment between us." "I know, Lester," she said earnestly, looking him straight in the eyes. "I promise I'll never conceal anything more. Truly I won't. I've been afraid, but I won't be now. You can trust me." "That sounds like what you ought to be," he replied. "I know you will." And he let her go. A few days later, and in consequence of this agreement, the future of Gerhardt came up for discussion. Jennie had been worrying about him for several days. Now it occurred to her that this was something to talk over with Lester. Accordingly, she explained one night at dinner what had happened in Cleveland. "I know he is very unhappy there all alone," she said, "and I hate to think of it. I was going to get him if I went back to Cleveland. Now I don't know what to do about it." "Why don't you send him some money?" he inquired. "He won't take any more money from me, Lester," she explained. "He thinks I'm not good, not acting right. He doesn't believe I'm married." "He has pretty good reason, hasn't he?" said Lester calmly. "I hate to think of him sleeping in a factory. He's so old and lonely." "What's the matter with the rest of the family in Cleveland? Won't they do anything for him? Where's your brother Bass?" "I think maybe they don't want him. He's so cross," she said simply. "I hardly know what to suggest in that case," smiled Lester. "The old gentleman oughtn't to be so fussy." "I know," she said, "but he's old now, and he has had so much trouble." Lester ruminated for a while, toying with his fork. "I'll tell you what I've been thinking, Jennie," he said finally. "There's no use living this way any longer if we're going to stick it out. I've been thinking that we might take a house out in Hyde Park. It's something of a run from the office, but I'm not much for this apartment life. You and Vesta would be better off for a yard. In that case you might bring your father on to live with us. He couldn't do any harm pottering about. Indeed, he might help keep things straight." "Oh, that would just suit Papa if he'd come," she replied. "He loves to fix things, and he'd cut the grass and look after the furnace. But he won't come unless he's sure I am married." "I don't know how that could be arranged unless you could show the old gentleman a marriage certificate. He seems to want something that can't be produced very well. A steady job he'd have running the furnace of a country house," he added meditatively. Jennie did not notice the grimness of the jest. She was too busy thinking what a tangle she had made of her life. Gerhardt would not come now, even if they had a lovely home to share with him, and yet he ought to be with Vesta again. She would make him happy. She remained lost in a sad abstraction until Lester, following the drift of her thoughts, said, "I don't see how it can be arranged. Marriage certificate blanks aren't easily procurable. It's bad business, a criminal offense to forge one, I believe. I wouldn't want to be mixed up in that sort of thing." "Oh, I don't want you to do anything like that, Lester. I'm just sorry Papa is so stubborn. When he gets a notion, you can't change him." "Suppose we wait until we get settled after moving," he suggested. "Then you can go to Cleveland and talk to him personally. You might be able to persuade him." He liked her attitude toward her father. It was so decent that he rather wished he could help her carry out her scheme. While not very interesting, Gerhardt was not objectionable to Lester, and if the old man wanted to do the odd jobs around a big place, why not? End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The plan for a residence in Hyde Park was not long in taking shape. After several weeks had passed and things had quieted down again, Lester invited Jennie to go with him to South Hyde Park to look for a house. On the first trip they found something which seemed to suit admirably. An old-time house of 11 large rooms, set in a lawn fully 200 feet square and shaded by trees which had been planted when the city was young. It was ornate, homelike, peaceful. Jennie was fascinated by the sense of space and country, although depressed by the reflection that she was not entering her new home under the right auspices. She had vaguely hoped that in planning to go away she was bringing about a condition under which Lester might have come after her and married her. Now all that was over. She had promised to stay, and she would have to make the best of it. She suggested that they would never know what to do with so much room, but he waved that aside. "We will very likely have people in now and then," he said. "We can furnish it up anyhow and see how it looks." He had the agent make out a 5-year lease with an option for renewal, and set at once the forces to work to put the establishment in order. The house was painted and decorated, the lawn put in order, and everything done to give the place a trim and satisfactory appearance. There was a large, comfortable library and sitting room, a big dining room, a handsome reception hall, a parlor, a large kitchen, serving room, and in fact all the ground floor essentials of a comfortable home. On the second floor were bedrooms, baths, and the maid's room. It was all very comfortable and harmonious, and Jennie took an immense pride and pleasure in getting things in order. Immediately after moving in, Jennie, with Lester's permission, wrote to her father asking him to come to her. She did not say that she was married, but left it to be inferred. She descanted on the beauty of the neighborhood, the size of the yard, and the manifold conveniences of the establishment. "It is so very nice," she added. "You would like it, Papa. Vesta is here and goes to school every day. Won't you come and stay with us? It's so much better than living in a factory, and I would like to have you so." Gerhardt read this letter with a solemn countenance. Was it really true? Would they be taking a larger house if they were not permanently united? After all these years and all this lying, could he have been mistaken? Well, it was high time. But should he go? He had lived alone this long time now. Should he go to Chicago and live with Jennie? Her appeal did touch him, but somehow he decided against it. That would be too generous an acknowledgment of the fact that there had been fault on his side as well as on hers. Jennie was disappointed at Gerhardt's refusal. She talked it over with Lester and decided that she would go on to Cleveland and see him. Accordingly, she made the trip, hunted up the factory, a great rumbling furniture concern in one of the poorest sections of the city, and inquired at the office for her father. The clerk directed her to a distant warehouse, and Gerhardt was informed that a lady wished to see him. He crawled out of his humble cot and came down, curious as to who it could be. When Jennie saw him in his dusty, baggy clothes, his hair gray, his eyebrows shaggy, coming out of the dark door, a keen sense of the pathetic moved her again. Poor Papa, she thought. He came toward her, his inquisitorial eye softened a little by his consciousness of the affection that had inspired her visit. "What are you come for?" he asked cautiously. "I want you to come home with me, Papa," she pleaded yearningly. "I don't want you to stay here any more. I can't think of you living alone any longer." "So," he said, nonplussed, "that brings you?" "Yes," she replied. Won't you? Don't stay here." "I have a good bed," he explained, by way of apology for his state. "I know," she replied, "but we have a good home now, and Vesta is there. Won't you come? Lester wants you to." "Tell me one thing," he demanded. "Are you married?" "Yes," she replied, lying hopelessly. "I have been married a long time. You can ask Lester when you come." She could scarcely look him in the face, but she managed somehow, and he believed her. "Well," he said, "it is time." "Won't you come, papa?" she pleaded. He threw out his hands after his characteristic manner. The urgency of her appeal touched him to the quick. "Yes, I come," he said, and turned. But she saw by his shoulders what was happening. He was crying. "Now, papa," she pleaded. For answer he walked back into the dark warehouse to get his things. End of chapter 37. Chapter 38 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Gerhardt, having become an inmate of the Hyde Park home, at once bestirred himself about the labors which he felt instinctively concerned him. He took charge of the furnace and the yard, outraged at the thought that good money should be paid to any outsider when he had nothing to do. The trees, he declared to Jennie, were in a dreadful condition. If Lester would get him a pruning knife and a saw, he would attend to them in the spring. In Germany they knew how to care for such things, but these Americans were so shiftless. Then he wanted tools and nails, and in time all the closets and shelves were put in order. He found a Lutheran church almost 2 miles away, and declared that it was better than the one in Cleveland. The pastor, of course, was a heaven-sent son of divinity, and nothing would do but that Vesta must go to church with him regularly. Jennie and Lester settled down into the new order of living with some misgivings. Certain difficulties were sure to arise. On the North Side it had been easy for Jennie to shun neighbors and say nothing. Now they were occupying a house of some pretensions. Their immediate neighbors would feel it their duty to call, and Jennie would have to play the part of an experienced hostess. She and Lester had talked the situation over. It might as well be understood here, he said, that they were husband and wife. Vesta was to be introduced as Jennie's daughter by her first marriage, her husband, a Mr. Stover, her mother's maiden name, having died immediately after the child's birth. Lester, of course, was the stepfather. This particular neighborhood was so far from the fashionable heart of Chicago that Lester did not expect to run into many of his friends. He explained to Jennie the ordinary formalities of social intercourse, so that when the first visitor called, Jennie might be prepared to receive her. Within a fortnight this first visitor arrived in the person of Mrs. Jacob Stendahl, a woman of considerable importance in this particular section. She lived 5 doors from Jennie. The houses of the neighbors were all set in spacious lawns, and drove up in her carriage on her return from her shopping one afternoon. "Is Mrs. Kane in?" she asked of Jeannette, the new maid. "I think so, ma'am," answered the girl. "Won't you let me have your card?" The card was given and taken to Jennie, who looked at it curiously. When Jennie came into the parlor, Mrs. Stendahl, a tall, dark, inquisitive-looking woman, greeted her most cordially. "I thought I would take the liberty of intruding on you," she said most winningly. "I am one of your neighbors. I live on the other side of the street, some few doors up. Perhaps you have seen the house, the one with the white stone gate posts." "Oh, yes, indeed," replied Jennie. "I know it well. Mr. Kane and I were admiring it the first day we came out here." "I know your husband, of course, by reputation. My husband is connected with the Wilkes Frog and Switch Company." Jennie bowed her head. She knew that the latter concern must be something important and profitable from the way in which Mrs. Stendahl spoke of it. "We have lived here quite a number of years, and I know how you must feel coming as a total stranger to a new section of the city. I hope you will find time to come in and see me some afternoon. I shall be most pleased. My regular reception day is Thursday." "Indeed I shall," answered Jennie a little nervously, for the ordeal was a trying one. "I appreciate your goodness in calling. Mr. Kane is very busy as a rule, but when he is at home I am sure he would be most pleased to meet you and your husband." "You must both come over some evening," replied Mrs. Stendahl. "We lead a very quiet life. My husband is not much for social gatherings, but we enjoy our neighborhood friends." Jennie smiled her assurance of goodwill. She accompanied Mrs. Stendahl to the door and shook hands with her. "I'm so glad to find you so charming," observed Mrs. Stendahl frankly. "Oh, thank you," said Jennie, flushing a little. "I'm sure I don't deserve so much praise." "Well, now, I will expect you some afternoon. Good by," and she waved a gracious farewell. "That wasn't so bad," thought Jennie as she watched Mrs. Stendahl drive away. "She's very nice, I think. I'll tell Lester about her." Among the other callers were a Mr. and Mrs. Carmichael Burke, a Mrs. Hanson Field, and a Mrs. Timothy Ballinger, all of whom left cards, or stayed to chat a few minutes. Jennie found herself taken quite seriously as a woman of importance, and did her best to support the dignity of her position. And indeed she did exceptionally well. She was most hospitable and gracious. She had a kindly smile and a manner wholly natural. She succeeded in making a most favorable impression. She explained to her guests that she had been living on the North Side until recently, that her husband, Mr. Kane, had long wanted to have a home in Hyde Park, that her father and daughter were living here, and that Lester was the child's stepfather. She said she hoped to repay all these nice attentions and to be a good neighbor. Lester heard about these calls in the evening, for he did not care to meet these people. Jennie came to enjoy it in a mild way. She liked making new friends, and she was hoping that something definite could be worked out here which would make Lester look upon her as a good wife and an ideal companion. Perhaps some day he might really want to marry her. First impressions are not always permanent, as Jennie was soon to discover. The neighborhood had accepted her perhaps a little too hastily, and now rumors began to fly about. A Mrs. Somerville, calling on Mrs. Craig, one of Jennie's near neighbors, intimated that she knew who Lester was. "Oh, yes, indeed. You know, my dear," she went on, "his reputation is just a little—" She raised her eyebrows and her hand at the same time. "You don't say," commented her friend curiously. "He looks like such a staid, conservative person." "Oh, no doubt. In a way he is," went on Mrs. Somerville. "His family is of the very best. There was some young woman he went with, so my husband tells me. I don't know whether this is the one or not, but she was introduced as a Miss Gorwood, or some such name as that, when they were living together as husband and wife on the North Side." "Tisk, tisk, tisk," clicked Mrs. Craig, with her tongue at this astonishing news. "You don't tell me. Come to think of it, it must be the same woman. Her father's name is Gerhardt." "Gerhardt!" exclaimed Mrs. Somerville. "Yes, that's the name. It seems to me there was some earlier scandal in connection with her. At least there was a child. Whether he married her afterward or not, I don't know. Anyhow, I understand his family will not have anything to do with her." "How very interesting!" exclaimed Mrs. Craig. "And to think he should have married her afterward, if he really did. I'm sure you can't tell with whom you're coming in contact these days, can you?" "It's so true. Life gets badly mixed at times. She appears to be a charming woman." "Delightful!" exclaimed Mrs. Craig. "Quite naive. I was really taken with her." "Well, it may be," went on her guest, "that this isn't the same woman after all. I may be mistaken." "Oh, I hardly think so. Gerhardt, she told me that they had been living on the North Side." "Then I'm sure it's the same person. How curious that you should speak of her." "It is indeed," went on Mrs. Craig, who was speculating as to what her attitude toward Jennie should be in the future. Other rumors came from other sources. There were people who had seen Jennie and Lester out driving on the North Side, who had been introduced to her as Miss Gerhardt, who knew what the Kane family thought. Of course, her present position, the handsome house, the wealth of Lester, the beauty of Vesta, all these things helped to soften the situation. She was apparently too circumspect, too much the good wife and mother, too really nice to be angry with. But she had a past, and that had to be taken into consideration. An opening bolt of the coming storm fell upon Jennie one day when Vesta, returning from school, suddenly asked, "Mama, who was my papa?" "His name was Stover, dear," replied her mother, struck at once by the thought that there might have been some criticism, that someone must have been saying something. "Why do you ask?" "Where was I born?" continued Vesta, ignoring the last inquiry and interested in clearing up her own identity. "In Columbus, Ohio, pet. Why?" "Anita Ballinger said I didn't have any papa, that you weren't even married when you had me. She said I wasn't a really, truly girl at all, just a nobody. She made me so mad I slapped her." Jennie's face grew rigid. She sat staring straight before her. Mrs. Ballinger had called, and Jennie had thought her peculiarly gracious and helpful in her offer of assistance. And now her little daughter had said this to Vesta. Where did the child hear it? "You mustn't pay any attention to her, dearie," said Jennie at last. "She doesn't know. Your papa was Mr. Stover, and you were born in Columbus. You mustn't fight other little girls. Of course they say nasty things when they fight, sometimes things they don't really mean. Just let her alone and don't go near her any more. Then she won't say anything to you." It was a lame explanation, but it satisfied Vesta for the time being. "I'll slap her if she tries to slap me," she persisted. "You mustn't go near her, pet. Do you hear? Then she can't try to slap you," returned her mother. "Just go about your studies and don't mind her. She can't quarrel with you if you don't let her." Vesta went away, leaving Jennie brooding over her words. The neighbors were talking. Her history was becoming common gossip. How had they found out? It is one thing to nurse a single thrust, another to have the wound opened from time to time by additional stabs. One day Jennie, having gone to call on Mrs. Handsome Field, who was her immediate neighbor, met a Mrs. Williston Baker, who was there taking tea. Mrs. Baker knew of the Kanes, of Jennie's history on the North Side, and of the attitude of the Kane family. She was a thin, vigorous, intellectual woman, somewhat on the order of Mrs. Bracebridge, and very careful of her social connections. She had always considered Mrs. Field a woman of the same rigid circumspectness of attitude, and when she found Jennie calling there, she was outwardly calm, but inwardly irritated. "This is Mrs. Kane, Mrs. Baker," said Mrs. Field, introducing her guest with a smiling countenance. Mrs. Baker looked at Jennie ominously. "Mrs. Lester Kane?" she inquired. "Yes," replied Mrs. Fields. "Indeed," she went on freezingly. "I've heard a great deal about Mrs." accenting the word, "Mrs. Lester Kane." She turned to Mrs. Fields, ignoring Jennie completely, and started an intimate conversation in which Jennie could have no possible share. Jennie stood helplessly by, unable to formulate a thought which would be suitable to so trying a situation. Mrs. Baker soon announced her departure, although she had intended to stay longer. "I can't remain another minute," she said. "I promised Mrs. Neal that I would stop in to see her today. I'm sure I've bored you enough already as it is." She walked to the door, not troubling to look at Jennie until she was nearly out of the room. Then she looked in her direction and gave her a frigid nod. "We meet such curious people now and again," she observed finally to her hostess as she swept away. Mrs. Field did not feel able to defend Jennie, for she herself was in no notable social position and was endeavoring, like every other middle class woman of means, to get along. She did not care to offend Mrs. Williston Baker, who was socially so much more important than Jennie. She came back to where Jennie was sitting, smiling apologetically, but she was a little bit flustered. Jennie was out of countenance, of course. Presently she excused herself and went home. She had been cut deeply by the slight offered her, and she felt that Mrs. Field realized that she had made a mistake in ever taking her up. There would be no additional exchange of visits there, that she knew. The old hopeless feeling came over her that her life was a failure. It couldn't be made right, or if it could, it wouldn't be. Lester was not inclined to marry her and put her right. Time went on, and matters remained very much as they were. To look at this large house with its smooth lawn and its well-grown trees, its vines clambering about the pillars of the veranda and interlacing themselves into a transparent veil of green, to see Gerhardt pottering about the yard, Vesta coming home from school, Lester leaving in the morning in his smart trap, one would have said that here is peace and plenty. No shadow of unhappiness hangs over this charming home. As a matter of fact, existence with Lester and Jennie did run smoothly. It is true that the neighbors did not call any more, or only a very few of them, and there was no social life to speak of. But the deprivation was hardly noticed. There was so much in the home life to please and interest. Vesta was learning to play the piano, and to play quite well. She had a good ear for music. Jennie was a charming figure in blue, lavender, and olive green house gowns as she went about her affairs, sewing, dusting, getting Vesta off to school, and seeing that things generally were put to rights. Gerhardt busied himself about his multitudinous duties, for he was not satisfied unless he had his hands into all the domestic economies of the household. One of his self-imposed tasks was to go about the house after Lester or the servants, turning out the gas jets or electric light bulbs which might accidentally have been left burning. That was a sinful extravagance. Again, Lester's expensive clothes, which he carelessly threw aside after a few months' use, were a source of woe to the thrifty old German. Moreover, he grieved over splendid shoes discarded because of a few wrinkles in the leather or a slightly run-down heel or sole. Gerhardt was for having them repaired, but Lester answered the old man's querulous inquiry as to what was wrong with them shoes by saying that they weren't comfortable any more. Such extravagance, Gerhardt complained to Jennie. Such waste. No good can come of anything like that. It will mean want one of these days. He can't help it, Papa, Jennie excused. That's the way he was raised. Ha! A fine way to be raised. These Americans, they know nothing of economy. They ought to live in Germany a while. Then they would know what a dollar can do. Lester heard some of this through Jennie, but he only smiled. Gerhardt was amusing to him. Another grievance was Lester's extravagant use of matches. He had the habit of striking a match, holding it while he talked instead of lighting his cigar, and then throwing it away. Sometimes he would begin to light a cigar 2 or 3 minutes before he would actually do so, tossing aside match after match. There was a place out in one corner of the veranda where he liked to sit of a spring or summer evening, smoking and throwing away half-burned matches. Jennie would sit with him, and a vast number of matches would be lit and flung out on the lawn. At one time, while engaged in cutting the grass, Gerhardt found, to his horror, not a handful, but literally boxes of half-burned matchsticks lying unconsumed and decaying under the fallen blades. He was discouraged, to say the least. He gathered up this damning evidence in a newspaper and carried it back into the sitting room where Jennie was sewing. "See here what I find," he demanded. "Just look at that. That man, he has no more sense of economy than a—" The right term failed him. "He sits and smokes, and this is the way he uses matches.
5 cents a box they cost, 5 cents. How can a man hope to do well and carry on like that, I'd like to know? Look at them." Jennie looked. She shook her head. "Lester is extravagant," she said. Gerhardt carried them to the basement. At least they should be burned in the furnace. He would have used them as lighters for his own pipe, sticking them in the fire to catch a blaze, only old newspapers were better, and he had stacks of these, another evidence of his lord and master's wretched, spendthrift disposition. It was a sad world to work in. Almost everything was against him. Still he fought as valiantly as he could against waste and shameless extravagance. His own economies were rigid. He would wear the same suit of black, cut down from one of Lester's expensive investments of years before, every Sunday for a couple of years. Lester's shoes, by a little stretch of the imagination, could be made to seem to fit, and these he wore. His old ties also, the black ones, they were fine. If he could have cut down Lester's shirts he would have done so. He did make over the underwear with the friendly aid of the cook's needle. Lester's socks, of course, were just right. There was never any expense for Gerhardt's clothing. The remaining stock of Lester's discarded clothing, shoes, shirts, collars, suits, ties, and what not, he would store away for weeks and months, and then, in a sad and gloomy frame of mind, he would call in a tailor or an old shoeman or a ragman and dispose of the lot at the best price he could. He learned that all second-hand clothesmen were sharks, that there was no use in putting the least faith in the protests of any rag dealer or old shoeman. They all lied. They all claimed to be very poor, when, as a matter of fact, they were actually rolling in wealth. Gerhardt had investigated these stories. He had followed them up. He had seen what they were doing with the things he sold them. "Scoundrels," he declared. "They offer me 10 cents for a pair of shoes, and then I see them hanging out in the front of their places marked $2. Such robbery! My God, they could afford to give me $1." Jennie smiled. It was only to her that he complained, for he could expect no sympathy from Lester. So far as his own meager store of money was concerned, he gave most of it to his beloved church, where he was considered to be a model of propriety, honesty, faith, in fact, the embodiment of all the virtues. And so, for all the ill winds that were beginning to blow socially, Jennie was now leading the dream years of her existence. Lester, in spite of the doubts which assailed him at times as to the wisdom of his career, was invariably kind and considerate, and he seemed to enjoy his home life. "Everything all right?" she would ask when he came in of an evening. "Sure," he would answer, and pinch her chin or cheek. She would follow him in, while Jeannette, always alert, would take his coat and hat. In the winter time they would sit in the library before the big grate fire. In the spring and summer or fall, Lester preferred to walk out on the porch, one corner of which commanded a sweeping view of the lawn and the distant street, and light his before-dinner cigar. Jennie would sit on the side of his chair and stroke his head. "Your hair is not getting the least bit thin, Lester. Aren't you glad?" she would say. Or, "Oh, see how your brow is wrinkled now. You mustn't do that. You didn't change your tie, mister, this morning. Why didn't you? I laid one out for you." "Oh, I forgot," he would answer, or he would cause the wrinkles to disappear, or laughingly predict that he would soon be getting bald if he wasn't so now. In the drawing room or library before Vesta and Gerhardt, she was not less loving, though a little bit more circumspect. She loved old puzzles like pigs in clover, the spider hole, baby billiards, and the like. Lester shared in these simple amusements. He would work by the hour if necessary to make a difficult puzzle come right. Jennie was clever at solving these mechanical problems. Sometimes she would have to show him the right method, and then she would be immensely pleased with herself. At other times she would stand behind him, watching, her chin on his shoulder, her arms about his neck. He seemed not to mind. Indeed, he was happy in the wealth of affection she bestowed. Her cleverness, her gentleness, her tact created an atmosphere which was immensely pleasing. Above all, her youth and beauty appealed to him. It made him feel young, and if there was one thing Lester objected to, it was the thought of drying up into an aimless old age. "I want to keep young or die young," was one of his pet remarks, and Jennie came to understand. She was glad that she was so much younger now for his sake. Another pleasant feature of the home life was Lester's steadily increasing affection for Vesta. The child would sit at the big table in the library in the evenings, conning her books, while Jennie would sew and Gerhardt would read his interminable list of German Lutheran papers. It grieved the old man that Vesta should not be allowed to go to a German Lutheran parochial school, but Lester would listen to nothing of the sort. "We'll not have any thick-headed German training in this," he said to Jennie when she suggested that Gerhardt had complained. "The public schools are good enough for any child. You tell him to let her alone." There were really some delightful hours among the four. Lester liked to take the little 7-year-old schoolgirl between his knees and tease her. He liked to invert the so-called facts of life, to propound its paradoxes, and watch how the child's budding mind took them. "What's water?" he would ask, and being informed that it was what we drink, he would stare and say, "That's so, but what is it? Don't they teach you any better than that?" "Well, it is what we drink, isn't it?" persisted Vesta. "The fact that we drink it doesn't explain what it is," he would retort. "You ask your teacher what water is," and then he would leave her with this irritating problem troubling her young soul. Food, china, her dress, anything was apt to be brought back to its chemical constituents, and he would leave her to struggle with these dark suggestions of something else back of the superficial appearance of things until she was actually in awe of him. She had a way of showing him how nice she looked before she started to school in the morning, a habit that arose because of his constant criticism of her appearance. He wanted her to look smart. He insisted on a big bow of blue ribbon for her hair. He demanded that her shoes be changed from low quarter to high boots with the changing character of the seasons, and that her clothing be carried out on a color scheme suited to her complexion and disposition. "The child's light and gay by disposition. Don't put anything somber on her," he once remarked. Jennie had come to realize that he must be consulted in this, and would say, "Run to your papa and show him how you look." Vesta would come and turn briskly around before him, saying, "See?" "Yes, you're all right. Go on," and on she would go. He grew so proud of her that on Sundays and some weekdays, when they drove, he would always have her between them. He insisted that Jennie send her to dancing school, and Gerhardt was beside himself with rage and grief. "Such irreligion," he complained to Jennie. "Such devil's fol-de-rol. Now she goes to dance. What for? To make a no good out of her, a creature to be ashamed of." "Oh no, papa," replied Jennie. "It isn't as bad as that. This is an awfully nice school. Lester says she has to go." Lester, Lester, that man! A fine lot he knows about what is good for a child. A card player, a whiskey drinker. "Now hush, papa. I won't have you talk like that," Jennie would reply warmly. "He's a good man, and you know it." "Yes, yes, a good man in some things maybe. Not in this. No." He went away groaning. When Lester was near he said nothing, and Vesta could wind him around her finger. "Oh, you," she would say, pulling at his arm or rubbing his grizzled cheek. There was no more fight in Gerhardt when Vesta did this. He lost control of himself. Something welled up and choked his throat. "Yes, I know how you do," he would exclaim. Vesta would tweak his ear. "Stop now," he would say. "That is enough." It was noticeable, however, that she did not have to stop unless she herself willed it. Gerhardt adored the child, and she could do anything with him. He was always her devoted servitor. End of chapter 38. Chapter 39 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore Dreiser.
This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. During this period, the dissatisfaction of Kane's family with Lester's irregular habit of life grew steadily stronger. That it could not help but become an open scandal in the course of time was sufficiently obvious to them. Rumors were already going about. People seemed to understand in a wise way, though nothing was ever said directly. Kane Sr. could scarcely imagine what possessed his son to fly in the face of conventions in this manner. If the woman had been some one of distinction, some sorceress of the stage or of the world of art or letters, his action would have been explicable if not commendable. But with this creature of very ordinary capabilities, as Louise had described her, this putty-faced nobody, he could not possibly understand it. Lester was his son, his favorite son. It was too bad he had not settled down in the ordinary way. Look at the women in Cincinnati who knew him and liked him. Take Letty Pace, for instance. Why, in the name of common sense, had he not married her? She was good-looking, sympathetic, talented. The old man grieved bitterly, and then by degrees he began to harden. It seemed a shame that Lester should treat him so. It wasn't natural or justifiable or decent. Archibald Kane brooded over it until he felt that some change ought to be enforced, but just what it should be he could not say. Lester was his own boss, and he would resent any criticism of his actions. Apparently, nothing could be done. Certain changes helped along an approaching denouement. Louise married not many months after her very disturbing visit to Chicago, and then the home property was fairly empty except for visiting grandchildren. Lester did not attend the wedding, though he was invited. For another thing, Mrs. Kane died, making a readjustment of the family will necessary. Lester came home on this occasion, grieved to think that he had lately seen so little of his mother, and that he had caused her so much pain, but he had no explanation to make. His father thought at the time of talking to him, but put it off because of his obvious gloom. He went back to Chicago, and there were more months of silence. After Mrs. Kane's death and Louise's marriage, the father went to live with Robert, for his 3 grandchildren afforded him his greatest pleasure in his old age. The business, except for the final adjustment which would come after his death, was in Robert's hand. The latter was consistently agreeable to his sisters and their husbands and to his father, in view of the eventual control he hoped to obtain. He was not a sycophant in any sense of the word, but a shrewd, cold business man, far shrewder than his brother gave him credit for. He was already richer than any 2 of the other children put together, but he chose to keep his counsel and to pretend modesty of fortune. He realized the danger of envy, and preferred a Spartan form of existence, putting all the emphasis on inconspicuous but very ready and very hard cash. While Lester was drifting, Robert was working all the time. Robert's scheme for eliminating his brother from participation in the control of the business was really not very essential, for his father, after long brooding over the details of the Chicago situation, had come to the definite conclusion that any large share of his property ought not to go to Lester. Obviously, Lester was not so strong a man as he had thought him to be. Of the 2 brothers, Lester might be the bigger intellectually or sympathetically, artistically and socially. There was no comparison. But Robert got commercial results in a silent, effective way. If Lester was not going to pull himself together at this stage of the game, when would he? Better leave his property to those who would take care of it. Archibald Kane thought seriously of having his lawyer revise his will in such a way that, unless Lester should reform, he would be cut off with only a nominal income. But he decided to give Lester one more chance, to make a plea, in fact, that he should abandon his false way of living and put himself on a sound basis before the world. It wasn't too late. He really had a great future.
Would he deliberately choose to throw it away? Old Archibald wrote Lester that he would like to have a talk with him at his convenience, and within the lapse of 36 hours Lester was in Cincinnati. "I thought I'd have one more talk with you, Lester, on a subject that's rather difficult for me to bring up," began the elder Kane. "You know what I'm referring to?" "Yes, I know," replied Lester calmly. "I used to think, when I was much younger, that my son's matrimonial ventures would never concern me, but I changed my views on that score when I got a little further along. I began to see, through my business connections, how much the right sort of marriage helps a man, and then I got rather anxious that my boys should marry well. I used to worry about you, Lester, and I'm worrying yet. This recent connection you've made has caused me no end of trouble. It worried your mother up to the very last. It was her one great sorrow. Don't you think you have gone far enough with it? The scandal has reached down here. What it is in Chicago I don't know, but it can't be a secret. That can't help the house and business there. It certainly can't help you. The whole thing has gone on so long that you have injured your prospects all around, and yet you continue. Why do you?" "I suppose because I love her," Lester replied. "You can't be serious in that," said his father. "If you loved her, you'd have married her in the first place. Surely you wouldn't take a woman and live with her as you have with this woman for years, disgracing her and yourself, and still claim that you love her. You may have a passion for her, but it isn't love." "How do you know I haven't married her?" inquired Lester coolly. He wanted to see how his father would take to that idea. "You're not serious?" The old gentleman propped himself up on his arms and looked at him. "No, I'm not," replied Lester, "but I might be. I might marry her." "Impossible!" exclaimed his father vigorously. "I can't believe it. I can't believe a man of your intelligence would do a thing like that, Lester. Where's your judgment? Why, you've lived in open adultery with her for years, and now you talk of marrying her. Why, in heaven's name, if you were going to do anything like that, didn't you do it in the first place? Disgrace your parents, break your mother's heart, injure the business, become a public scandal, and then marry the cause of it. I don't believe it." Old Archibald got up. "Don't get excited, father," said Lester quickly. "We won't get anywhere that way. I say I might marry her. She's not a bad woman, and I wish you wouldn't talk about her as you do. You've never seen her. You know nothing about her." "I know enough," insisted old Archibald determinedly. "I know that no good woman would act as she has done. Why, man, she's after your money. What else could she want? It's as plain as the nose on your face." "Father," said Lester, his voice lowering ominously, "why do you talk like that? You never saw the woman. You wouldn't know her from Adam's off ox. Louise comes down here and gives an excited report, and you people swallow it whole. She isn't as bad as you think she is. I wouldn't use the language you're using about her if I were you. You're doing a good woman an injustice, and you won't for some reason be fair." "Fair? Fair?" interrupted Archibald. "Talk about being fair. Is it fair to me, to your family, to your dead mother, to take a woman of the streets and live with her? Is it?" "Stop now, father," exclaimed Lester, putting up his hand. "I warn you. I won't listen to talk like that. You're talking about the woman I'm living with, that I may marry. I love you, but I won't have you saying things that aren't so. She isn't a woman of the streets. You know, as well as you know anything, that I wouldn't take up with a woman of that kind. We'll have to discuss this in a calmer mood, or I won't stay here. I'm sorry. I'm awfully sorry, but I won't listen to any such language as that." Old Archibald quieted himself. In spite of his opposition, he respected his son's point of view. He sat back in his chair and stared at the floor. How was he to handle this thing, he asked himself. "Are you living in the same place?" he finally inquired. "No, we've moved out to Hyde Park. I've taken a house out there." "I hear there's a child. Is that yours?" "No." "Have you any children of your own?" "No." "Well, that's a God's blessing. Lester merely scratched his chin. "And you insist you will marry her?" Archibald went on. "I didn't say that," replied his son. "I said I might." "Might, might!" exclaimed his father, his anger bubbling again. "What a tragedy! You with your prospects, your outlook. How do you suppose I can seriously contemplate entrusting my share of my fortune to a man who has so little regard for what the world considers as right and proper? Why, Lester, this carriage business, your family, your personal reputation appear to be as nothing at all to you. I can't understand what has happened to your pride. It seems like some wild, impossible fancy." "It's pretty hard to explain, father, and I can't do it very well. I simply know that I'm in this affair and that I'm bound to see it through. It may come out all right. I may not marry her. I may. I'm not prepared now to say what I'll do. You'll have to wait. I'll do the best I can." Old Archibald merely shook his head disapprovingly. "You've made a bad mess of this, Lester," he said finally. "Surely you have. But I suppose you are determined to go your way. Nothing that I have said appears to move you." "Not now, father. I'm sorry." "Well, I warn you, then, that unless you show some consideration for the dignity of your family and the honor of your position, it will make a difference in my will. I can't go on countenancing this thing and not be a party to it morally and every other way. I won't do it. You can leave her or you can marry her. You certainly ought to do one or the other. If you leave her, everything will be all right. You may make any provision for her you like. I have no objection to that. I'll gladly pay whatever you agree to. You will share with the rest of the children just as I had planned. If you marry her, it will make a difference. Now do as you please, but don't blame me. I love you. I'm your father. I'm doing what I think is my bounden duty. Now you think that over and let me know." Lester sighed. He saw how hopeless this argument was. He felt that his father probably meant what he said, but how could he leave Jennie and justify himself to himself? Would his father really cut him off? Surely not. The old gentleman loved him even now. He could see it. Lester felt troubled and distressed. This attempt at coercion irritated him. The idea he, Lester Kane, being made to do such a thing to throw Jennie down. He stared at the floor. Old Archibald saw that he had let fly a telling bullet. "Well," said Lester finally, "there's no use our discussing it any further now. That's certain, isn't it? I can't say what I'll do. I'll have to take time and think. I can't decide this offhand." The two looked at each other. Lester was sorry for the world's attitude and for his father's keen feeling about the affair. Kane Sr. was sorry for his son, but he was determined to see the thing through. He wasn't sure whether he had converted Lester or not, but he was hopeful. Maybe he would come around yet. "Good-bye, father," said Lester, holding out his hand. "I think I'll try and make that 2:10 train. There isn't anything else you wanted to see me about?" "No." The old man sat there after Lester had gone, thinking deeply. What a twisted career! What an end to great possibilities! What a foolhardy persistence in evil and error! He shook his head. Robert was wiser. He was the one to control a business. He was cool and conservative. If Lester were only like that! He thought and thought. It was a long time before he stirred, and still, in the bottom of his heart, his erring son continued to appeal to him. End of chapter 39. Chapter 40 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Lester returned to Chicago. He realized that he had offended his father seriously. How seriously he could not say. In all his personal relations with old Archibald, he had never seen him so worked up. But even now Lester did not feel that the breach was irreparable. He hardly realized that it was necessary for him to act decisively. if he hoped to retain his father's affection and confidence. As for the world at large, what did it matter how much people talked or what they said? He was big enough to stand alone. But was he? People turn so quickly from weakness or the shadow of it, to get away from failure, even the mere suspicion of it, that seems to be a subconscious feeling with the average man and woman. We all avoid non-success, as though we fear that it may prove contagious. Lester was soon to feel the force of this prejudice. One day Lester happened to run across Berry Dodge, the millionaire head of Dodge, Holbrook, and Kingsbury, a firm that stood in the dry goods world, where the Kane Company stood in the carriage world. Dodge had been one of Lester's best friends. He knew him as intimately as he knew Henry Bracebridge of Cleveland and George Knowles of Cincinnati. He visited at his handsome home on the North Shore Drive, and they met constantly in a business and social way. But since Lester had moved out to Hyde Park, the old intimacy had lapsed. Now they came face to face on Michigan Avenue near the Kane Building. "Why, Lester, I'm glad to see you again," said Dodge. He extended a formal hand and seemed just a little cool. "I hear you've gone and married since I saw you." "No, nothing like that," replied Lester easily, with the air of one who prefers to be understood in the way of the world's sense. "Why so secret about it if you have?" asked Dodge, attempting to smile, but with a wry twist to the corners of his mouth. He was trying to be nice and to go through a difficult situation gracefully. "We fellows usually make a fuss about that sort of thing. You ought to let your friends know." "Well," said Lester, feeling the edge of the social blade that was being driven into him, "I thought I'd do it in a new way. I'm not much for excitement in that direction, anyhow." "It is a matter of taste, isn't it?" said Dodge, a little absently. "You're living in the city, of course." "In Hyde Park." "That's a pleasant territory. How are things otherwise?" And he deftly changed the subject before waving him a perfunctory farewell. Lester missed at once the inquiries which a man like Dodge would have made if he had really believed that he was married. Under ordinary circumstances his friend would have wanted to know a great deal about the new Mrs. Kane. There would have been all those little familiar touches common to people living on the same social plane. Dodge would have asked Lester to bring his wife over to see them, would have definitely promised to call. Nothing of the sort happened, and Lester noticed the significant omission. It was the same with the Berman Moores, the Henry Aldriches, and a score of other people whom he knew equally well. Apparently they all thought that he had married and settled down. They were interested to know where he was living, and they were rather disposed to joke him about being so very secretive on the subject. But they were not willing to discuss the supposed Mrs. Kane. He was beginning to see that this move of his was going to tell against him notably. One of the worst stabs, it was the cruelest because, in a way, it was the most unintentional, he received from an old acquaintance, Will Whitney, at the Union Club. Lester was dining there one evening, and Whitney met him in the main reading room as he was crossing from the cloakroom to the cigar stand. The latter was a typical society figure, tall, lean, smooth-faced, immaculately garbed, a little cynical, and tonight a little the worse for liquor. "Hi, Lester," he called out. "What's this talk about a menage of yours out in Hyde Park? Say, you're going some. How are you going to explain all this to your wife when you get married?" "I don't have to explain it," replied Lester irritably. "Why should you be so interested in my affairs? You're not living in a stone house, are you?" "Say, that's pretty good now, isn't it? You didn't marry that little beauty you used to travel around with on the North Side, did you? Now, well, I swear you're married. You didn't now, did you?" "Cut it out, Whitney," said Lester roughly. "You're talking wild." "Pardon, Lester," said the other aimlessly but sobering. "I beg your pardon. Remember, I'm just a little warm. 8 whiskey sours straight in the other room there. Pardon. I'll talk to you some time when I'm all right. See, Lester? I'm a little loose. That's right. Well, so long. Lester could not get over the cacophonous ha. It cut him, even though it came from a drunken man's mouth. That little beauty you used to travel with on the North Side, you didn't marry her, did you? He quoted Whitney's impertinence resentfully. George. But this was getting a little rough. He had never endured anything like this before. He, Lester Kane. It set him thinking. Certainly he was paying dearly for trying to do the kind thing by Jennie. End of chapter 40.